Welcome to RBC Disruptors. I'm John Stackhouse, and today we're having a very special conversation about an incredibly serious issue in advance of next week, which is Mental Health Awareness Week in Canada and in many parts of the world. And we're joined by three extraordinary Canadians to talk not only about the challenges of mental health, but what we can do with technology to address one of the great health concerns of our time that we all know is around us. We know is in our organizations, in our communities, and in our country. This is an issue that RBC has been deeply committed to for many years. Over the last 10 years, we have committed $40 million to youth mental health, and that commitment will continue. It's an issue we're engaged with increasingly as an employer and trying to talk to our clients and communities about. And today's conversation is meant to help with that. Welcome to everyone watching on WebEx. Please join the conversation, share your questions, share your insights, and please continue the conversation online and through social media afterwards. You'll know our first guest, Silken Lauman, the great Olympic rower. We're also joined by Sam Duboc and Dan Siedan. Silken is a three-time Olympic three-time Olympic medalist, gold medalist at both the World Championships and the Pan Am. We've just revised it to Olympic gold medalist. That sounds good, but you're an extraordinary athlete and a great Canadian. And if you've not read her book, Unsinkable, I highly recommend it. It's an extraordinary story with lots of great insights that she'll speak to. Sam Duboc is Chairman and CEO of MindBEAcon, a digital CBT, that's cognitive behavioral therapy platform. Sam's a great Bay Street veteran, co-founded Edgestone Capital and Loyalty Group, which we better know as Air Miles, and he was on the board of CAMH and has an incredible story that he'll share. And then on my far left is Dan Siedan, a Canadian who's now based in the Valley. He is the CEO of a Bay Area company called Stigma, which is a mental health awareness app that he'll describe in more detail. So Dan, Sam, and Silken, welcome to RBC Disruptors.
Great to be here. Great to be here.
We're going to start with a bit of storytelling because each of our guests wants to share a bit about their own journey with mental health, and I'm sure this is something everyone in the room can relate to. But Silken, maybe we can start with you because you reveal so much about not just yourself and your family, but I think the challenges that we can all relate to in terms of the anxieties and mental health issues that we know exist around us or within us. What did you learn about yourself in sharing that story?
Well, you know, I wrote Unsinkable in the privacy of my living room, and you know, was absolutely terrified to publish it because I was coming forward with my mental health story, with the story of my life, which included overcoming abuse in the home, and I was incredibly challenged to understand, like, how is this going to change people's perception of who I was? How is it going to affect Canadians' perception of who I was? How is it going to affect my family? But I got to a place in my life where, like, to not share the story almost felt inauthentic because it was such a big part of who I was. I wasn't just that Olympic athlete who overcame an accident 10 weeks before the Olympic Games. I had overcome a lot of challenge in my life. And I also felt when I was writing my book that if I had had a book like that to read, about from another peer, from another Olympic athlete, that would have helped me so much. Because one of the things about mental illness and struggling is that you always feel like you're alone, and that somehow, you know, you don't deserve the help, or your problems aren't big enough, or it's just a very isolating experience. So over the last 5 years, not only did I publish the book, I started speaking about my journey publicly. And it's not just a story of mental health, it's a story of whole health, you know, like how to become fully who you are in the world, how to become the best version kind of yourself. And part of that is by dealing with the things that are holding you back.
And we're going to come back to several of the insights you've gained over those years. I wonder if you might touch on how you came to grips with the challenges in your past, because you had a very public life. Yeah. Probably many of us felt like we've known you for years or decades, but it wasn't until after you were that great Olympian in our living rooms, that you sort of came to grips with these demons, if I can call them that, from your own background.
So for me, it was when I was raising my kids, who were 2 and 4 at the time, and I got to the point in my life where I just had the inability to cope. I had a moment outside a hotel room in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was with my 2 young children, and I suddenly felt overwhelming rage towards my own children. And it was a terrifying moment. And it was the moment that I first reached out for help. I called a friend and said, I don't know what's going on in my life, but I need some help. And she called a counselor, and that counselor called me, and that was the moment that things changed for me, was when I reached out for help. And I think in doing so, I started to learn more about my story. I mean, we all go on in our lives, and we have our challenges, and a lot of the time we don't realize how our past is affecting our present today, and how our past is affecting the choices that we made today. And I realized growing up with a mom who had an undiagnosed mental illness and was at the best of times completely unpredictable, how that had affected me and impacted me. And so I had to go back into my past and do that healing work. So I think as an Olympic athlete, to a large extent, I was unaware of how the past had been driving me and affecting my behavior. Right. So it was really as a young mother that I began to understand its effect.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Sam, you are having an extraordinary business career, but something happened 7 years ago that really changed your course. Maybe you can share
for me,
with us.
It was really the straw that broke the camel's back. I was sitting at my desk at 7:34 in the morning on October 18, 2011. It's one of those moments you never forget. And the phone rang, and then rang a couple minutes later, so I ignored it, and it was my sister telling my brother had dropped dead while walking to work in Zurich, Switzerland. And in the previous 16 months, I'd had 2 heart operations. My dad had died. I was very close. We'd had a few other, what in our business we call life events. And I'm not unique. It's my version of life happens, just like life happens to everyone. It does happen to everyone. But for me, that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And I remember getting up, and about 3 weeks later, or I would say trying to get out of bed, it was really hard, and turning to my wife and admitting for the first time what I didn't want to admit to anyone, and even to myself. I'm a kid from the Midwest of the United States. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. You don't talk about mental health. You gut it out. You get over it. You suck it up. But I turned and I said, I'm depressed. Like, I'm clinically depressed. I'd been on the board of the CAMH Foundation, and so I knew all the theory of it. But on that day, theory collided with reality. And that's really what sort of woke me up to the struggles of mental health and the difficulty, because I knew the system. I had the resources, thankfully. But getting that help and my search for help was really, really hard, and much harder than it should be, and much harder than I thought it would be. And whether it's trying to find a therapist, the public systems are designed to deal with crisis, and they do that fairly well. But if you're like the vast majority of the 1 in 5 that suffer, and those that suffer mild to moderate to moderately severe, that aren't going to spend 16 hours of sessions leaving work for 3 hours, you suffer in silence. And then you try and navigate a very difficult system where, to a large degree, there are no outcome measures. There's no way to actually judge who's good, who's not. In our situation, it's not like it's not strep throat. You don't go take a pill and you're better. It's talking about how do you change and resilience and deal with it on an ongoing basis.
So going back to that conversation with your wife after you came to grips with it or opened up about it, what did you do next? Because I'd been on the board of CAMH, I called a very good friend, a guy named David Goldblum, who was a senior psychiatrist, and I described what I was going through, and David kind of like very quickly said, Sam, you're no different than millions of other Canadians. You're classically depressed. And of course, my initial response was, yeah, no, not me. Not me. I'd started Air Miles, a bunch of other companies, and raised a lot of money, and I'm going, yeah, not me. But over time, I came to realize it was me, and that's what really changed my outlook back in 2011-12, and what led us to start the business and to really, our goal is very simple. We're trying to bring effective, evidence-based mental health care available, accessible, and affordable to all. Right, thank you. Dan, maybe you can share a bit of insight from your own background and your encounter with mental health challenges, what was it, 7, 8 years ago? And what got you going on this journey with Stigma?
Yeah. 8 years ago, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I, at the time, had no knowledge about what mental health was, even though my mom, who's here today, was a psychiatrist at the time. My whole life was flipped upside down. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I dropped out of school. I had all these plans to go and fix the world. I had no fear, no anxiety, no insecurities, and complete hope and optimism. But then I was locked up in a psych ward. I lost my liberty. And the next 2 years were the most difficult years of my life. It wasn't until I started realizing how my behaviors impact my wellness that I started to find some stability, and accepting that this is something that I deal with, and accepting that medication is something that's actually good for me. And this started lining up towards a belief that I developed that one day we will have technology that can automatically track our wellness. We have tools that track so many different parts of our life, but wellness actually seems like the most important metric. And why aren't we tracking that today? So I looked around, see what people were doing in this space. I didn't feel like anyone was making any amounts of significant progress based on the technologies that are available today. So I taught myself how to code. I built myself a tool to track my mood. I track my mood every day for 3,000 times in journaling. What are the things that I see that positively or negatively impact my mood? Did that almost every day for 3 years, and now we finally built technology that can automatically track your wellness. And this, I see, unlocks a number of opportunities around innovations in the mental health space. And I'm excited to share a little bit more about that today.
No, we can't wait to hear more. Silken, before I turn to you, I'd just like to thank the three of you for opening up like that. We talk a lot in business and probably in all walks of life about courage. I've just seen three incredible displays of courage, so thank you for opening up. Silken, you get to travel the country now, a great country that you love, and you hear from Canadians of all ages and in all places about these challenges. You can share a bit about what you're hearing.
Well, I think there's a huge appetite for this conversation around mental health. I mean, the statistics were on the board as we came in. 50% of people will have a mental health crisis in sort of the next decade, right? And so it's something that everybody's dealing with. Everybody has a child, everybody has a parent, everybody has a neighbor, right? So I think there's this tremendous desire to start to take it out of the closet, to start talking about it, and to normalize the conversation around mental health. We have talked about it in a silo, like mental health lives here and our health lives over here, like so far apart, right? But there's such a connection between our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health, what Dan's talking about, right, the tracking, right? Like, how do our behaviors affect our health? And so what I'm really getting from, when I first started to share my story, as I said, there's this very isolating, I think, effect of experiencing a mental illness. You think that you're the only person like you experiencing, right? And there is a them and us mentality. There's the people who suffer from mental illness, and then there's the rest of us. And I think what I was hearing, and was I told a lot about how I speak about my experiences, was normalizing the conversation around mental health. Because I think of health in such an integrated way, I guess, speaking about it now for 5 years, I don't feel the same kind of stigma that I did when I first started speaking about it. Everybody is touched by this issue, and we're all looking at ways of getting healthier. None of us are perfectly mentally healthy. And so I think the kind of initiatives that both Sam and Dan are talking about today are so powerful, because like what Sam's doing, for instance, is increasing the capacity for help. Because the other thing that I hear a lot is, yeah, I need to get help, but I can't afford counseling. I don't know how to get a good counselor. And there is a real lack of funding. This is a real thing for how much mental illness is now talked about, and we're starting to end the stigma around it. We have to now back it up with the resources. So great that we're talking about, very important that we're talking about it, because I think the stigma has prevented people from getting the help they need. The next step is, how are we going to start funding it, and how are we going to start talking about it in a way that's integrated into our healthcare model?
That's a great point. We're talking about it, and that's a huge accomplishment, but what are we doing about it? Sam and Dan, maybe we can turn the conversation a bit to you. Silken, you're doing lots about it, so I want you to jump in on this, but the focus of today's conversation is technology, and what do some of the great technologies that are changing other aspects of our lives allow us, or what will they allow us to do that we might not have been able to do a decade or two decades ago. Dan, I want to jump to you, and maybe you can talk a bit about what Stigma is doing and what you hope it will do, and then we'll come to Sam and talk a bit about Beacon and where he's taking that.
So originally we built a tool that helps people manually track their emotions, and we help people, or we have 250,000 people do this, track their emotions over 4 million times, and with all this data.
Can you describe a bit of how one tracks their emotions with the tool?
So you can select from a variety of emotions, what are you feeling, or write down the degree of happiness or sadness that you're experiencing. But as we might get into later, manual tracking is not a habit that people keep up. And the whole goal with this wasn't to create a tool that made people do more work to manage something that's already really difficult to manage. So now we have software that can automatically track your wellness. So for instance, this could be, it can act like a Fitbit for your emotions. It uses facial recognition, which I know is alarming to some, but it tracks the degree of happiness, sadness, and anxiety or stress that you're experiencing. We can do this multiple times a second, as frequently as you would like. And for anyone who wants to improve their emotional intelligence, having these granular insights into your life is really helpful. And this unlocks a number of opportunities. I think once you have this tracker out there, shortly after, we can start measuring and improving your experience of navigating the internet. So we can now know what content are you consuming that is emotional malware. We can know what content are
you just said emotional malware.
Emotional malware.
Right.
Can you explain that a bit more? That's a fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, look at, Facebook has released studies to show that people who consume Facebook passively, it's actually damaging their mental health. It's causing them more depression and more anxiety. Now, to what degree? What actual articles? Is it articles from Fox News? Is it? I don't know. We don't have the data yet, so I'm not. Or is it a certain amount of cat videos that you watch over a period of time? Right. But on the other hand, we can also understand from a computational level what articles and content and videos can you consume that actually positively impact your wellness. And once you have this technology, you could go and crawl the internet and feed back information of the best content to help you improve your wellness. And that I'm quite excited about. I mean, who doesn't want to be fed the information that's best for their wellness?
Yeah, and Dan, it's interesting just what you're saying, because I think, like, as a parent, I've got an 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-old, right? And then I'm always saying, oh, don't watch so much of that stuff. It's going to make you feel bad. Or, get out and get some more fresh air, do some more sport. And I think they're just like, to a certain degree. But, like, the fact that you can measure it, I think is really important. Like, measure what content is doing to your overall well-being. This generation is just obsessed with things that you can measure, right? And so I really love that idea.
Right. Yeah,
Go ahead, please.
I think this is something that is very much seeded from the way my parents helped me learn about my emotional intelligence. They kept on asking me, hey, how are you feeling today? And it bugged me, especially when I didn't have language to describe my emotions. I had a very low emotional intelligence, and slowly and still working on improving it. And they would know which friends of mine are negatively impacting my emotional state. And who knows that today? Like, how do you know the people that you spend your time with, how they actually impact your wellness? the people that you could spend your time with, that you could swipe. Like, imagine one day you could swipe and see this person over here. We predict that they'll actually have the best positive impact on your emotional state over the long term.
So we're going to get into lots of privacy questions rooted there. Fantastic what you're doing at an individual level, but there's systems challenges and opportunities too. And Sam, maybe you can explain a bit about what MindBEAcon is doing at that level.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. And actually, I should turn it over to Silken because she did a great job. Thank you for, here's what we're about. The vast majority of people don't get help. The vast majority of people can't get help. They either won't seek it because of barriers of time, geography, or stigma, or they won't do it because they don't want to actually confess their feelings like I was back in 2011, or they can't afford it. Vast majority of people can't do that. And the reality is if you start doing the math on the 1 in 5 Canadians, 50% in the next decade, like you start doing the math, you can't solve it with humans. There's not enough money, there's not enough training, there are not enough people. And the reality is quality control becomes very difficult. Like there's so many problems with solving it. So really what we decided to do, and again, it's about making effective, evidence-based, I echo Dan's commentary, we're very much data-driven geeks in our business about this. Evidence-based, effective mental health care available, affordable, and accessible. And what we've used is, and technology is really just the enabler to us. Technology is not the end here at all. So what we do is real simple, is we're firm believers of a 50-year-old proven product called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's been around, like I said, 50 years. There are hundreds of studies that prove its effectiveness.
Do you want to explain a bit about CBT?
So what CBT does, it comes out of Stoicism. It was developed back in the 60s and 70s, largely popularized in a book called Mind Over Mood. I always reverse the two. And what it really does, it teaches you how your thoughts and actions affect your emotions and how you can actually do those to your advantage. And so, you're on Facebook or you're on something else or someone doesn't return your phone call. And when you're depressed, weird things happen like, I'm not a good person because you didn't return my phone call. And it teaches you how to start thinking through that. Well, wait a minute, maybe John's just busy. Maybe John's got other stuff. Maybe John's got a problem. It teaches you how to, which I know doesn't happen often, but maybe the problem's not me, maybe the problem's something else. It teaches you how to think your way out of that. So in other words, to bring you out of that doom spiral, back up. It teaches you a lot of other stuff to do that. But it's been proven to work as effectively as drugs. It has a resiliency effect that drugs obviously don't have. And it doesn't have the side effects that many of the drugs have. I've taken the drugs. The drugs have some side effects which are unfortunate. They kind of flatline you in certain cases. So if you can avoid them, you avoid them. In cases you can't, then absolutely the drugs are the right answer. I'm not anti-drug at all. I'm pro-drug where it makes sense. So what we do is we're firm believers in cognitive behavioral therapy. And when you pair that with a therapist who you work with, what you find is you can get very high results doing it on a digital tool, when, where, how you want it. And people will actually log on that will never log on before. Mm-hmm. People will actually do it. The key is getting to that 80% or 70% of people that will never walk into our clinics. We're the largest clinic operation in Ontario. We'll see 20, 30,000 people in our clinics this year for anxiety, depression, and other things. But we're also now the only and the largest national provider of digital cognitive behavioral therapy. You take a rigorous assessment. Why? Because we have to measure, you have to understand what's really the problem. So we have a very deep and rigorous assessment. We then pair you with a college-registered, trained mental health professional who sticks with you. They're a person. They're not a call center. They're not a bot, although we do use artificial intelligence to augment that. And then what happens, you work through our protocols, and we have protocols that cover anxiety, depression, panic, PTSD, soon to be alcohol, OCD, and then importantly, a lot of the comorbid decisions, because if you have a heart attack, 80% of the time you'll be severely depressed. If you have diabetes, I can tell you if you get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, you don't walk away high-fiving people. Unfortunately, you get very anxious. And so we have ways you can do that. And the data from across the world shows that if you stick to the protocols and if someone works with you and shows they care and helps you through them, you can get through it better. You can actually have better results than we get in our clinics for those that are mild to moderate to moderately severe. For those that are severe or in crisis, absolutely go see the healthcare professionals. What we're about, and we're working with a hospital right now, for instance, has a 3,000 person wait list. Yeah. By the way, that's forever. There's no timing on that. You ask them what the timing of the 3,000th person is, and they're basically gone before, they won't come back. Like, we'll see them.
Well, or they end up in the emergency
or they in the emergency room and clog it up. And so what we're doing is we're trying to say, let's take 70 or 80% of those people, which will work on the digital therapy, let's pull them out of the wait list. Let's leave our human resources that are terrific in Canada, but limited, let's leave those for the people that are highly ill. And that's what we're all about.
And I don't think we appreciate as Canadians how limited the supply of professional help is in the country. The shortage, and it gets into a critical level in rural Canada. If you try to find a psychiatrist or a psychologist in Saskatoon or North Bay, or Saskatchewan, I should say, or North Bay.
Well, I was going to say Saskatoon, you're lucky. But you go to North Bay, and the other problem is you might play golf with that person.
Yeah.
And by the way, I went and saw a psychologist that I actually hung out with a little bit, and we both decided after one session that, yeah, that wasn't going to work. Right? Yeah, like, you know, I'm open and I don't really have a problem with stigma, but I don't really want to talk to you about this. It kind of messes up the golf game. Yeah. So, you know, because, you don't really want to be on the 8th hole going, yeah, whatever. But that's right. Rural Canadians, young Canadians, we're finding a huge amount of take-up with our university population. So we serve a bunch of universities now. And people say they want to see people in person. A lot of that's the common thing I get back is, oh no, it only in person works. Well, the data is actually not that. The data is that if you stick to the therapy, actually it works better for mild to moderate. The data says that. But also, if you're a college-age individual, are you really going to walk into the health center and see the person that's manning the desk and paying for their university experience? Actually, you walk up to your buddy who you sit next to in math class, and you're here to see the psychologist? It's not going to happen. Yeah. We're here to try and help with those people that won't do it.
There's lots of larger companies and institutions, I'm thinking of the insurers, who are trying to address this same challenge. Given their scale, why can't they do this?
Well, companies are doing it. Companies are starting to do it, and they're starting to listen, and the efforts that Silken and others are doing, George Cope and the founding of Bell Let's Talk, you got to have a special shout out to those. I saw Jamie Anderson and the work that he's doing with CAMH in making it okay to talk. I mean, you talked about, Silken, earlier about talking about it and making it okay, like we talk about our physical health and everything like that. I don't get it. We're in an RBC building. Dustin Johnson, one of your great golfers with an RBC logo on his arm, has a professional psychologist and head coach with him every day. Why is it a problem for one of us to have one? I got, a throat infection a couple months ago. I went and dealt with it. Why is depression different from a throat infection? You have issues you deal with financial problems. Why is a financial problem different from a mental problem, different from a health problem? Why should you, and I appreciate the fact you said we had the courage, but when you said that, I actually went, why does it have to be courageous for me to sit up in front of how many people here and tell them, yeah, I'm like everybody else, I got depressed. Why is that courage? That's the problem.
Well, because you're a pioneer,
yeah, but I don't want to be a pioneer. I want to be like I want everybody to feel like they can be pioneers.
Yeah, but when I asked why others aren't doing it, I was thinking not of talking about it, but doing something with it. And
yeah.
Well, and it seems like our healthcare system covers certain things. Yeah. So if you need to take a medication for a mental health issue, that medication may or may not be covered depending whether your health plan, but you can get it prescribed through your doctor. You can go see the doctor and tell them that you're experiencing depression and maybe even have a diagnosis. But you're all talking about the lifestyle, the behavior, the thoughts, right? So we know that maybe the end result is that you wake up one morning and you're clinically depressed, but a whole bunch of things happened to get you there. Maybe you were working too hard. Maybe you weren't addressing problems as they came up. Maybe you actually had a completely out of control lifestyle. There's so many things that impact your mental health, and to pretend that they don't, which I think is kind of what we're doing in our healthcare system, is we're pretending that it doesn't matter that you don't have time to exercise. Again, the Olympic athlete talking about exercise. It was predictable, folks. But I mean, exercise has a huge impact in how you feel. Endorphins are real. Our brain chemistry is a real thing. And yoga, meditation, journaling, all of these things, some people still kind of consider woo-woo. That idea that meditation might help your mental health and your physical health. But the truth is meditation changes your physiology, which impacts your emotional and mental well-being.
Right.
So it's the physical, the mental, the emotional, your thoughts, everything affected by breath.
So you pretty much
So
answered
no funding goes into teaching people how to meditate, you know, or taking a yoga class. But we're gonna pay for somebody to take meditation.
And John, I would like to talk about that. The other issue you brought up about the insurance companies, people are starting to do something. Some insurance companies are offering discounts for the wearables and such like that. Green Shield Canada, great partner of ours, now offers Beacon to all their clients. But Manulife, Sun Life, other great partners of ours, they offer it to their clients as well. And they're starting to jump into that. Manulife, in fact, just announced yesterday they made an investment in our business to help us grow it faster. It's out of their venture capital arm along with TELUS. So they are starting to, but we need to get the ball rolling, because what happens is we need to get people from the ground up telling their employers, telling the insurance, hey, we want you to cover, we want you to help us with our mental health. The companies will react then. It won't be it won't be coming from the top. It's got to come up from the bottom.
demand driven.
It's got to be demand driven.
Yeah, and that's so powerful too, because I think we have looked at mental health like to the experts. You know, let's talk to the psychiatrists, let's talk to the counselors. But it seems like a lot of the solutions are coming from people who've had lived experience. That they're saying, hey, this worked for me, and there's nothing out there like it, so I'm going to invent it. You know, or I went and tried to access psychologists and counselors, and I had a hard time finding it, so I created something to change the problem. And one of the things that I heard a lot, you asked me one of your earlier questions when I was on the road, was that people want to hear each other's stories, and they want to hear stories that are hopeful and helpful, of people who've struggled and have overcome. And I mean, everybody on the panel here is in that position, right? Where there's been some really dark moments in our lives. There have been experiences that brought us to our knees. And we've taken those experiences and been changed and been built by those experiences. I am grateful in some odd way for the dysfunction I experienced as a child. I wouldn't want it to happen to the kid next door. But I know it gave me the resilience and the toughness to do something extraordinary with my life. And the times when I've struggled the most have also led to a deepening and a wisdom that I know I wouldn't have had without those experiences. So I think we need to start talking about that part too. It's not all doom and gloom. It's about life, isn't it? Like, life just throws us so many curveballs, and it does bring us to our knees. And it's what we do about it, and it's about accessing the help when we most need it, and it's about talking to one another about our experiences, so we start to understand, hey, this is like actually part of the experience of being a human.
So interesting to hear you talk, because when we say reflect on physical wellness and how that became mainstream, it wasn't because doctors said you should do this, or schools said you should do it, or companies said you should do it. It's because people started to model themselves after people who they wanted to be more like, and maybe we're starting to see that with mental wellness as well. It's going to be driven by good examples of people taking a position and sharing their stories.
Yeah, I think we're just starting to, like, you know, the people who've been through it are starting to say, like, this worked for me, and this worked for me, and that's so important. I mean, my husband has rheumatoid arthritis. He's had it since he was 32 years old. It literally flattened him, and he was told when he was first diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis to not exercise. He has a fitness company. That was not going to happen, right?
Like a problem.
And now, you know what they tell you when you have rheumatoid arthritis is never stop moving, because you know you'll lose what you have if you stop moving. And so I think there's going to be a lot of this learned experience over the next decade that we're going to be sharing with each other. It's like, hey, you know what? Journaling, I don't know why it works, but it really works, you know? I don't know why it works to not drink coffee when you have anxiety, but it really makes a difference.
But a number of professionals watching this may say, okay, that sounds fine, but professional knowledge is required as well. And it's a bit Wild West, if I can call it that right now, especially in the internet space. There's something like 48,000 apps health and fitness apps now on the App Store. None of it really regulated. And I'm curious, Sam and Dan, how you wrestle with that. You're doing fascinating things, but in an unregulated space that is ultimately about people's health that does require some professional knowledge and standards.
Yeah, so I think looking at how we have regulated medication is an interesting analogy. Well, it's interesting to bring up at the very least, because most of the antidepressants that are out there on the market right now have a warning of a side effect that these might cause suicidal ideations.
Right.
And thinking through how do we go about regulating, what are we doing today? Well, the tools and products that are used by over 2 billion people are causing more anxiety and depression. No one's going to go, like, we can't really expect Facebook to get regulated, but what we can do is start pressuring these companies to, one, building awareness to how do these products impact our wellness, which will educate consumers to change behaviors, and also pressure these companies to start. I think these large tech companies have the ability to have the greatest impact on society's mental health. They're not doing that today. It might take a little while.
What's the single thing you would tell them to do to take that on?
Measure people's wellness. And they're very good at optimizing for things that they choose to measure and prioritize. If they want to go and improve people's wellness, they can measure it, and it wouldn't be too hard for their engineers to actually go and do that. And many of them start, all like Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, all have made public commitments to actually improve people's wellness. They're calling it digital wellness. While it's very early on, I am excited to see what is to come from these technological changes. And on the flip side, measuring, being able to measure how certain therapists or therapeutic applications impact people's wellness, help people know what tools are actually good for them as an individual and at a large as society. And of the tools that are available, which therapists are most effective, which can even help your company run more effectively and be able to see which therapists should we be working with or which therapists are excelling. And it's exciting.
Sam, how are you thinking through the regulatory question?
So the regulatory and the effectiveness question are obviously, in our view, highly linked. And that's why, being the largest provider of in-clinic services with about 75 PhDs that work with us on a day-to-day basis, it was important for us when we started the digital side, because we were originally going to build the Sleep Country Canada of psychology clinics. That was our first thought. And why sleep? I was actually the guy that gave Steve Gunn the money when I was at CIBC, so I know Sleep Country really well. So we were going to become the Psychology Country Canada, and we were going to build clinics across. But we realized that didn't solve the affordability and other stuff. But our heritage is deep treatment versus a lot of the wellness apps you see are sort of highly or light apps. And if you go through the thing, what we found was marrying the true professionals. So the work that we do, seeing tens and tens of thousands of people every year in our clinics, marrying their understanding and using digital technology to really enable them to see a massively higher amount of people in a very effective way. It enabled them to be more effective at what they do. Now, we had to change the way they worked. We had to work with that. But we did it. We're partners with CAMH. We're partners with Ryerson. We're partners with the University of Regina, which happens to be one of the world's leading places for digital cognitive behavioral therapy. But you start with the professionals, you start with that, and you move that into the digital world. We didn't come at it from, let's divide a digital application and let's move down into treatment. We said, how do we make this treatment as effective in the digital world, and therefore make it available and accessible and affordable? Our full course for a full year of treatment is something like 5 to 10 to 15%, depending upon how you source it, as it would be to go see one of our clinicians.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to turn to some questions coming in from WebEx. One of them is, what's the best way to open employer and healthcare systems to better understand how to accept mental health? And I wonder if, Silken, you might speak a bit to this, because you get to engage with so many audiences across the country. But to accept mental health and to reduce stigma, what can we as employers and as organizations do to facilitate these sorts of conversations?
It's actually a super complex question, isn't it? Because, like, on the one hand, you could just answer and say, well, we just need to be more accepting and understand, sometimes an employee has a flu, sometimes they're struggling with anxiety, and see it that way. I think a lot of employers are afraid of the long-term consequences of hiring somebody who has, a diagnosed mental illness. And there still is a lot of not only stigma, but sort of maybe misinformation of what that means. So I think the best thing is to continue to educate ourselves and to continue to dialogue so that we understand that, people with pretty serious diagnosis are doing meaningful work and are, incredibly productive employees. So that the label of a mental illness doesn't have to be sort of like a sentence to a non-productive life. So I think there's a lot of education going around. But the reality is that there's still lots of employers that don't have good benefit packages around mental illness and are not supportive. So, again, we just got to keep talking about it. We've got to keep sharing. We've got to look at solutions. And when Dan was talking about our system, and I think maybe that's why you brought us all here today, because I guess in a way we are disruptors. We're all thinking and talking about mental health a little bit differently. And I think our system, mental health system, our health system, has been built on a crisis mode and an illness mode, right? So when we start talking about like prevention and wellness, it's not necessarily something that the system has been built or equipped to be able to navigate. And so I think it's taking people who are disrupting the system to say, like, well, obviously what we're doing is not working. We've got to start thinking about it a lot differently.
Let me take a little bit more of a crass angle at it. Okay. When someone goes on long-term disability, which, by the way, mental health is the #1 thing for long-term disability in Canada. There's something like 500,000 or 600,000 people off right now. The insurance company provisions $200,000 for that. All right. If you look at the cost of absenteeism, Tufts University, I admit I'm an alum, so don't take this as a pitch, but I just wanted to clear my conflict because we're in an age where you have to declare your conflicts. The Tufts University just did a meta study. What they looked at is absenteeism from disability versus presenteeism, and it's up to 10 times that number. Okay?
Like the cost?
The cost. So the cost of the person, like I went to work every week. The cost of me sitting in a corner to my company was far, far higher than the cost of, just immensely higher. So what companies and HR professionals are beginning to get convinced about, which is when we're having some success with, a lot of success with this actually, is there is a demonstrable, clear return on investment to invest in mental health for your employees. So is it the right thing to do? Absolutely. Do you have a happier workforce? You absolutely do have a happier workforce. But you have a far better bottom line if you invest in mental health, just like the physicals that everybody gets and just like what they're doing out with your physical health and what people are doing with their financial health. There is a triangle that people are realizing. It's financial, physical, and mental go together. And as you place the employee in the center of that, the return on investment is demonstrable and large.
And that return can be measured right across the
economy.
And
can absolutely be, absolutely, can you measure absolutely, like advertising, can I give you the exact dollars, right? The old story about you don't know which 50% doesn't work. But there is so much evidence right now that you have to be remarkably cynical not to see it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic
remarkably
point.
cynical.
I'm curious how you go about measuring, if you're able to talk about it here, how you measure the impact.
Well, George Cope will tell you, to everybody, I've seen him give speeches where the decline in short-term and long-term disability for the mental health awareness that they put in at Bell Canada has 2 to 3 times pays for that every year. So the decline in short and long-term disability rates, right? The decline in productivity and in presenteeism, much harder to do, which is why Tufts pulled together, I don't know, somebody who works for me in thing will have studied it better than I have, pulled together like 40 or 50 studies, much harder. That's why the estimate is 7.5 to 12 times, because it's harder to measure. But the measurement and decline in short-term and long-term disability is absolutely clear to do it. Your app will also help measure the productivity increase because of the happiness. There's a lot of studies out there that show people that are happy versus not. So having that data is critical. And your capability also allows for people like first responders to have early warning systems. You know, I firmly believe we are in the archaic dark ages of treating people that are already sick, and soon we will move in, hopefully, to the enlightened era where we actually are preventing people from getting sick. We're actually doing things up front. You know, we have a 6-phase program at MindBEAcon, and I'll tell you, I have been clear with everybody in our company, success for me is when some form of beacon, you have to retask it, is a class in every high school in Canada.
So I think
that to me is success.
But Sam, unintentionally, you probably just touched the minority report question. And I want to move to privacy here.
Yep.
And curious, Dan, how you're wrestling with these questions about privacy, about data, and what we can intentionally and unintentionally protect.
Yeah, so I think a controversial outlook. We see privacy as our biggest competition. And for analogy's sake, let's bucket all these large technology companies into one group. Let's call this person a friend. And this friend we started developing a relationship with over many years. This friend provided us great experiences, great memories, but they started doing things to us that we weren't expecting. They started taking things from us that we didn't know that they were taking from. And then they were caught and they apologized, but they kept on doing it. So will people keep being friends with this friend? Well, we do. We do it every day. But this has caused many people's privacy concerns. And on the inverse, the more information that we can measure of you in all dimensions of your life are areas where we can help you better understand how any of that impacts your wellness and help you improve it. So there's an interesting combating force, and over 60% of the population in developed countries have concerns around technology or data collection from technology companies. And our thoughts on moving forward with this is being incredibly transparent about what we do collect, giving people the options to, I mean, one, this is an optional tool. By no means we are the government of China or London recording everyone at all times, though there are a lot of societal benefits to doing such. You give people the option to treat the data in the way that they want to be treated as a good friend.
So you're both wrestling, and you mentioned earlier with artificial intelligence. I'm curious, Sam and Dan, where you think AI is going to take this space over the next several years. Maybe Dan, you can start.
Yeah, so I have a dream of having an artificial intelligent friend that fulfills my social requirements better than anyone else. And I probably won't stop until I have found that.
That's dog, by the way.
That's dog.
Yeah.
I was actually going to ask you to list your social requirements, but anyway.
I would ask the AI, because it probably knows better than me.
I'm a similar being.
Good point. Good point.
Dog has not fulfilled them yet, but dog does a great job. The question, remind me of the question.
Where is AI going to take this conversation, and what you're trying to do over the next few years?
Yeah, so I think in the workforces are we're talking to a large bank right now, which may or may not be RBC. We can't say at this point in time, but working with them to help them get a pulse on their employees' mental wellness and get a pulse on their productivity and give them guidance on what they can do to actually improve that. At a larger scope, I foresee every single company that interfaces with consumers or employees using technology to track people's wellness. And this will enable all of these companies to build products designed to improve our well-being. That sounds like a very compelling world outside of the privacy concerns. Like, who does not want to live in a world designed to improve people's wellness? And for us to get there, we have to measure it. So I presume there are going to be a number of companies using automated wellness tracking, and at the moment we are the group that's pushing that forward.
And Sam, how soon are we going to see AI playing a significant role in the space that you're delving into?
Oh, it already does. I mean, you look at things coming out of the Wobot coming out of Stanford University, which has already been demonstrated to, which is a chat bot using some AI. There are other advantages. You look at what we do. We already look at things that you write back in your thought records and such, and we measure that on sentiment analysis using some sentiment analysis databases, very, very basic stuff, against what you actually report to see where there's disconnects. And then our therapists are able to go in and say, hey, you know, there are disconnects here. In the future, as you look at our rigorous assessment, we're already starting to see patterns and trends. I mean, you know, when you say AI, let's sort of make sure everybody, you know, AI is this sort of amorphous term. You know, it's really high-speed data analytics at this stage. But we're using data analytics to sort of assess. We can see people's patterns in how you go through our assessment, what you answer, where you answer, and the correlation with outcomes and other that. We obviously use it as well to measure our different therapists so that they can get better. But we're very careful on privacy. And one of the things that we're very careful about is we never use individual data outside the client-therapist relationship. It's never identified. It's always, any of the databases and analysis it's done, it's always group data, de-identified to no smaller rather than 100 people blocks, so that there is, when we're reporting back and saying, hey, you know, it looks like your call center has some anxiety issues. All right, so pick RBC, you have large call centers around the world. Your call center has a larger anxiety issue than, say, other call centers, which we can measure through our assessment tools. Is that gives you a way to say, hey, you know, that call center up at Young and Lawrence, or that call center in wherever, let's focus some efforts over here. We don't need to focus as much over there. It allows you to be on a group basis proactive, but never on individual, because, you know, again, I grew up in a very libertarian, I will call it, household about, you know, very individual rights. I get real concerned, and you won't see us ever starting to target individuals' stuff and using that data. I get real concerned about people having my personal data on a de-identified basis.
I think we've got a couple of microphones, stand-up microphones, and time for a couple of questions if people want to line up. But while we wait for that, Sam, there's a question here for you out of WebEx, wondering about subscription rates for 16 to 25-year-olds. I don't know if you can get into that.
So if you're at several of the universities that offer us, it's nothing. If you are at, I assume subscription rates, they mean pricing, or do they mean take-up? I'm not really sure what.
Let's assume it's take-up.
Take-up rate. The take-up rate is pretty high, you know, sort of in the low mid percentage points of people using it. So if you think about 3, 4, 5% of an organization getting help, that's a big number at any one time.
Got a quick lineup here. Good morning.
Morning. First off, thank you for having this event. It's a great thing to start the conversation on. We've talked a lot about the cost and insurance companies covering medication or therapy and how AI is helping a lot of people, but we haven't really talked more about the vulnerable populations who are low income, who are actually homeless. I'm thinking a lot of that transition from, say, university to your employment. Like, my first job didn't have health insurance. Right. My first job barely paid me a living wage. In fact, it didn't. How can we help those people? How can we use technology to help people who can't afford basic mental health care?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Sam, I wonder if you want to take that one on in terms of accessibility.
Well, I'll just give you a real example of MindBEAcon. If you take MindBEAcon and you employ it in a health system, in sort of a local healthcare organization, you know, an average psychologist, the top psychologist or therapist, whoever, can see about 20 to 22 people a week. Okay, our MindBEAcon therapist, because of what the technology enables you to see 100 to 125 people at a time using that kind of thing. So the way you do it is use technology to dramatically lower the cost, or you keep the cost the same and you dramatically up the throughput. And that's what technology will enable the public system to do. If you look at what's happened in England, they have 1 million people going through talk therapy, IEPT, and they have tens and tens of thousands of people they pay full time. They've now come out, and the leader said, if I were doing it today, I'd move it all digital for the 70 or 80%, and I would do it that way because we can put 5 times the amount of people through it. So you've got to lower the cost or increase the capacity.
I'm going to move quickly through some other questions because we've got a good lineup here. Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Thanks everyone for coming. This has been awesome. I used to work at Twitter and Facebook, and they have so much wellness data, but they just don't share it. So I know that personally. My question is, this is awesome because it's so solution focused, where we're not talking about mental illness, we're talking about mental health promotion, right? And focusing on an individual level. helping people one by one with CBT with the Stigma app. Is that really your main focus, or are you looking more to change, quote unquote, the system and looking into government and regulations and fundraising and all of that? Or are you more focused on let's change mindsets, one person at a time?
Silken, do you want to take that one on? Do you think we need to keep this as an individual conversation or
I think
societal?
Both, right? I think both. We all hive off what we're best influenced to do. Like at the end of the day, I'm involved and interested in people's stories, right? So that's where I'm going to go. I want to hear people's stories. I want to publish people's stories. I want to have a podcast that shares people's stories, because I think there's enormous amounts that we can learn from one another. So, does the government have to change? Does our healthcare system need to change? Does our school system, to the first question, does our school system have to change so that, wellness, it starts at the very beginning of our lives, and our habits, like which everybody's been talking about in some way, change. So the technology, we're using technology for good here, right? So there's a lot of bad in technology too, right? So there's no coincidence that anxiety and depression is at its highest in our youth today. Right? So the fact that we're now looking at technology and some solutions that technology provides is really exciting. But the actual process of how we are going to get better is, in a way, right, fundamental things like going and talking to a counselor and, learning how to breathe and meditate, learning how food affects mood, potentially taking medication if that's part of your equation. So those fundamentals don't change. We just have different ways of accessing it. And I think that, for me, I'm going to continue to focus on the stigma, to focus on sharing people's stories in a way that's hopeful and helpful to others, because I know how much that's helped me in my life, and I think we all hive off what we're best at.
I think we've got time for one more quick question from the floor.
Hey, my name's Jonathan, and my question's mostly for Sam and Dan, because I go to high schools and I speak about reducing stigma around mental health. I love leveraging technology and giving students more resources. I'm curious, we talked a lot about MindBEAcon today, and we talked a lot about stigma today. Are there any other technologies that you really respect or that you see as up and coming so that other people can take advantage of as well?
I love meditation apps. I think I've tried for a while to get into the habit of meditation, and finally over the past 4 months I've been doing it every other day with quite observed and data-driven observations on how it's actually reduced my anxiety levels, increased baseline happiness levels. I'd be interested to see what the uptick is on for high school students around meditation, and how you can relay that information to them to actually convince them to use it.
And Headspace is a
really
good
Calm
one
and
for
Headspace.
people beginning.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're just running up against the limits of time here. And before we go, I'd like to mention that as a token of our appreciation, a donation is being made on behalf of our guests to philanthropies that they chose, Silken Good Life Kids Foundation. And I'm wondering if you can each say a word about why you chose these organizations. Sam, it's the Pathways to Education, and Dan, Electronic Frontier Foundation. So Silken.
So one of the other things that I'm incredibly passionate about is physical activity in kids, and Good Life Kids Foundation focuses on increasing opportunities for kids with special needs to get physically active. We have a daughter who has huge challenges with autism, and in that population is incredibly underserved in the area of physical activity. So that's where
that's
my
a great cause.
Going.
Sam,
Pathways Education is now nationally 22 sites across the country, about 10,000 kids every day. We go into places where the dropout rates in high school are over 50%, and we average about a 75% reduction in dropout rates and about a 300% increase in post-secondary, so dramatically altering the lives of these kids.
Great, thank you. And Dan?
The Electronic Frontier Foundation is a big proponent around privacy. They help pressure large tech companies to treat people's data more effectively. I think this is a very important issue, and I look forward to continuing to support them. Thank you.
So I hope we can continue this conversation immediately afterwards, but also online, especially over the next week. And to our audience, I hope you can also mark next Monday, our next Disruptors. It's fairly compressed coming into fall, but at noon we have Stuart Butterfield, the CEO of Slack, who will be here for an hour. So please join us for that conversation in person or through WebEx or Facebook. Follow us online. You can listen to this conversation through our podcast, through RBC Disruptors, as well as the one next Monday. On behalf of RBC Silken, Sam and Dan, thank you so much for sharing your time and your stories and your insights and your inspiration with us. And to the audience, thank you for joining us.